And we'll move on to our next speaker, who is our very own Amber Thalmayer from the University of Zurich. And she's going to talk about assessing mental health in Sub-Saharan Africa, EDIC and EMIC approaches.
That couldn't have been a better last comment from Brandon Court before going to my talk. Great. Well, thank you for the invitation to talk here today. The last 3 talks have been totally fascinating. And me and my team who are here also, we're really glad to be part of this, looking forward to these conversations. So for this very interdisciplinary group today, I decided to not do too much background. The prior talks gave a lot about, why it's important to take culture into consideration in mental health. Instead, I want to give you a little bit of a whirlwind tour through what we've been doing with an emphasis on our methods. So the question is how we've been finding a way to explore mental health and personality, integrating EMIC and EDIC, quantitative and qualitative approaches, and what we've learned from that so far. And I'm hoping that this fits in with the theme of this week, sparks discussion, maybe debate, maybe ideas for collaborations or ways to support each other with methods going forward. So specifically, I'll be talking about 2 interrelated projects. First, the Personality and Mental Health in Namibia project that I led from 2018 to 2021, and then the Africa Long Life Study, which has absorbed my waking hours since 2021. The overarching goals of both projects are twofold. On a scientific level, it's to better define what's more universal versus what is more culturally specific in psychology. And we're looking for ways to look at cultural distance from the West, in this case in African contexts, because similarities are going to hint at more universal features, while differences are going to indicate ways that social and cultural factors are relevant in psychology. I know this is a given for probably most of the people in this room, but with psychologists, it takes a lot of emphasis and a lot of examples to continually remind them how important culture is in psychology. In cross-cultural psychology now, there is more influence from a comparison, especially between wealthy East Asian countries and the West. But I share with African colleagues a passion to make the African context another major point of comparison in cross-cultural psychology. So on a practical level, the goal is to contribute useful knowledge for practitioners, for educators and policymakers. Specific to Namibia, there's trauma from decades of apartheid and the long struggle for independence. The needs are great. There's high rates of suicide and domestic violence. And there's also a great interest in what psychology has to offer. There are many Namibians studying psychology in hopes of helping their communities, but their training materials and textbooks are full of the Western bias, studies from Western samples that dominate psychology. So a larger local evidence base could improve this. In addition to the core goals, a core value of this research program is to allow it to be continually influenced by input from the community and reactions from community members. So in 2018, we embarked on a series of studies on personality and mental health, mainly not only with speakers of Khoikhoi, which is a Khoisan clicking language. This was a series of 4 mixed method studies, first building and developing a local model of personality structure, exploring the meaning and the context of terms, then looking at disorder symptoms and their associations in 3 language groups, and finally exploring idioms related to mental health. And as befits the goal to look at both universal and culturally specific aspects of mental health, multiple approaches were integrated. There were EMIC elements to build knowledge from the ground up. There were imported EDIC elements to allow for comparison to integrate into a larger research base. There were quantitative approaches using predetermined variables and qualitative approaches to get closer to local phenomena. So very briefly, to assess which personality characteristics are important to Khoikhoi speakers, we conducted a lexical study. Such studies are based on the rationale that the most important distinctions between people in a particular context are going to be encoded in the natural language. So we followed the 4 key steps that have been established in prior studies. We extracted all the words used to describe people from a dictionary. We reduced it to a usable number by getting rid of the less familiar or ones that didn't relate to psychology. We gave the list of terms to participants in the form of a survey, asking them to define a specific person with the terms. And then we looked at patterns of correlation between the words to define dimensions. So which of the terms group together and which of those groups account for the most variance in the sample. We used a preliminary exploration of the quantitative results to define follow-up questions. And then we conducted follow-up interviews with Sylvanus Job and myself. Here's 2 of our participants, a mother and daughter. Our number 1 topic here was that we were trying to make sense of words that were hard to understand. We don't have a lot of resources for translating Khoikhoi into English. We also explored local views on personality traits in a couple of other ways that I won't get into today, but some of which are discussed in this paper. After integrating the input from the interviewees, our final model had 11 factors. So for anyone familiar with the Big 5 model of personality traits, there was actually not a lot of overlap here, but these factors do sort moderately well into a higher order structure of 2 factors, similar to agency and communion. Today, I'm only going to talk about this first factor of temperance, which contrasts being engaged in religion, being religious, versus drinking too much, substance abuse. So over 95% of the population in Namibia is Christian, mostly Protestant, so that's the faith that's being referenced here. Being the first factor in the lexical study means that this is the dimension that captures the most variation in the data set. And that means that the targets that were described, some of them were very religious and never drink, whereas others drink a lot and are perceived as being not very religious. Combining these 2 topics, religious engagement and substance abuse, on 1 factor is really unique worldwide in lexical studies. This is unusual that this would load together. But it did fit anecdotally with what I observed talking to Khoikhoi speakers in Namibia, which is that people would say things like that they've never tasted alcohol as a way of conveying their religious commitment. So the mental health part of the study then began with a survey of disorder symptoms, also personality, which for Khoikhoi speakers included something based on that lexical study, for everyone else, a more Western model. And then based on what we saw in the lexical study, we also included a measure of religious engagement. So this study was conducted with 3 samples in English in the capital city of Windhoek, in Oshawa up north along the Angolan border, and with Khoikhoi speakers throughout the country. So in terms of how to measure mental health symptoms, I considered a lot of options. I would have liked to find a more bottom-up approach like we used for personality, but I just wasn't able to come up with a strategy for that. So I decided to use an inventory, and then I searched all the different available options. And in the end, I decided that the one that I was creating with an industry partner in the US was the best available option I had. The advantages of this measure are that it's brief, it's free to use. And this is really important that it's brief. A lot of clinical measures are created. Pardon. Thank you. I'm getting over a cough. A lot of clinical measures are created for people that have already reported that they have problems and there's some differential diagnosis happening. But we wanted something that was appropriate for community members And then because you're making people think about their darkest experiences, their darkest moments, you don't want it to be too long because it can become quite distressing and unpleasant. So we wanted brief, concrete items. And then even though I was initially working on this in the US, I was already focused on an issue that plagues cross-cultural survey research, which is that almost all clinical scales use these vague subjective ratings. So here's a particular symptom. You were crying, you had trouble sleeping, you passed out from drinking. Did this happen often? Did it happen sometimes? Did it happen rarely? What do those mean? You can only answer those by comparing yourself to a few other people that you know well, or perhaps based on a self-schema. Are you someone that has this problem or not? And we know that this kind of rating scale leads to reference group effects. One example is that students at the schools that perform the best in the world will rate themselves on a self-report scale of academic talent worse than students at poorer schools because of who they're comparing themselves to and the standards they're comparing themselves to. So we decided to get away from this by having very concrete symptoms and then asking the last 30 days, how often did you experience this? And I want to note that the symptoms were developed from commonly used surveys from the DSM, the ICD. So these are relatively etic, imported symptoms to the Namibian context. But we didn't just seek to validate this scale. We were using it as a starting place, as a tool of exploration. So our interest from the outset was, how does this work? Which of these items work? How does it not work? Where are the problems? The inventories were translated using a day-long process, including these expert panel meetings where subject matter experts and linguists came to consensus on the proper wording. And then the process of refining and getting the language just right continued with those teams who, before they went out for data collection when we were training. So very briefly, to tie this back to the personality traits, the Khoikhoi speakers in the sample completed an inventory both based on the lexical study and traditional Big 5, 6 traits in translation. And we found that the Khoikhoi traits as a group better predicted some key outcomes, specifically overall mental health, substance abuse, and religious engagement. These topics aren't addressed very directly in Western personality inventories, but they're quite relevant to mental health and well-being for Khoikhoi speakers, and probably for other groups in Africa. And this is all described more here. So going a little deeper with the mental health scores, we compared the responses between the 3 Namibian groups and a sample of US employees. We used measurement invariance to test to what extent the items were responded to in similar patterns. And in fact, we found the patterns to be very similar for about half the syndromes. So the differences between the US and the 3 Namibian groups were not bigger. And what this means is that the Western conception of depression, which is that it includes social withdrawal, sad feelings, negative thoughts, etc., also fit reasonably well in this group in Namibia. For some other scales, patterns were more variable, which could be for a number of reasons. So another way we explored this data, looking for differences and similarities, is by looking at which items were answered the most differently between groups. Here's examples of some of the biggest differences. For simplicity, now I'm just showing Khoikhoi speakers and the US. And for example, both groups reported very similar amounts of drinking, but the Khoikhoi speakers reported a lot more feelings of guilt after the same amount of drinking and a lot more input from family and friends about their drinking, again, at the same level of drinking. And similarly for trauma, there was similar reports about having disturbing memories, but differences when it came to avoidance. So based on these results, we chose 3 topics for follow-up interviews. Post-traumatic stress and alcohol abuse based on what we just looked at, and depression for all the reasons that have been talked about earlier today, its significance around the world in terms of disability. Thanks to Sylvanus' job, we identified local idioms, the ways that people talk about these kinds of conditions in Khoikhoi, because these words were not directly translatable, and we didn't want to cue a Western conception. We held interviews with 26 participants. Due to the pandemic, I'm there on a WhatsApp video, on a phone, and Sylvanus' job was in person asking the questions in Khoikhoi, and I was speaking English, and the participants could respond in either. Usually they chose Khoikhoi. So there's a lot of interesting material here, and I'm just going to touch very briefly on a few comparative aspects. Basically, for these two internalizing type conditions, when it came to causes and symptoms, so what did the person do that made it apparent that something was wrong? We observed many congruencies. And I didn't list those, but they had to do with withdrawal and crying and repetitively speaking about the condition for trauma. Where we saw differences was in a lack of reference to a disposition of the person. There was always talking about that adversity and the context and not about biology or traits. So that relates back to our talk from Ed. There was also very little use of emotion words. The behaviors were very eloquent. They talked about someone who couldn't get out of bed or someone who was crying all the time, but they didn't necessarily use the word sad. When we asked about what happened, how did people get better, we heard very little reference to specialized care, formal structures for dealing with these problems, maybe a few references to a social worker or a psychologist or pastor, but much more reference to support from the community, especially through church and shared prayer. Mostly people just seemed to have each other, their friends, their families and neighbors, their church members, and themselves. Self-reliance was very much emphasized. People got better mostly through acceptance, through finding some way through prayer and spiritual values to accept the unacceptable. And they made the stakes of this clear that if you don't find a way to accept this, you're going to be in danger. The psychological pain will turn into physical illness, and you might even die. And more of this is discussed in this recent paper. In terms of drinking, again, the reasons for drinking were entirely contextual, did not have to do with the dispositions of the person, and taken together with what we saw about how people were getting better from loss and trauma, we felt these interviews helped us much better understand those results of the Lexical study, that first factor of temperance, contrasting being religious with being a drunkard, which is, we think, suggesting that the most important distinction, personality-wise, in this context that's shaped by African communalist values and by adversity is how do you access community in order to cope? Do you do that through shared prayer and religion, or do you do that through community at the bar? As soon as we began this project, I was continually told by Namibians two things. One was that people don't talk about these topics here. And the other was, we really need to talk more about these topics here. So we added this question at the end of the interviews. We asked people, how was it for you to talk to us today about these topics? And we got so much positive feedback. A lot of people used a metaphor of getting something out of the body. People told us we were the first people they had talked to about this, other than their mother when it happened, things like that. And we got a lot of blessings and encouragement to continue this kind of work in Namibia. Okay, so to wrap up there, in terms of measurement issues in the persona study, we learned that personality traits are not well assessed by Big Five or Big Six framework in the Khoikhoi language, but also in other languages in Africa that I've worked in. But some evidence that the Big Two might be a more useful, comparable, higher order framework to use. We found that mental health symptoms were assessed okay by our international mental health assessment. especially perhaps depression, less so a couple other domains. We learned a few things about what kind of items might be more useful to add as we continue trying to develop this. We also established measurement and variance, so good measurement properties for the Duke Religion Index and the satisfaction with life scale. And perhaps more broadly, we saw that dispositions are not a focus, at least for Khoikhoi speakers, and how they talk about where issues come from. But in fact, we did see that they predicted outcomes when we created the Khoikhoi personality inventory. And we learned that mental health research and discussion are quite welcome in Namibia, but of course, increased efforts should be more Afrocentric and not imposing a biomedical model. And it looks like religious engagement and community support are really important in protecting mental health. So, are you doing for time?
7 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so this will be brief then. So in 2021, I came here to the University of Zurich with 5 years of funding for the Africa Long Life Study. Longitudinal studies considered super important in psychology. They're like a gold standard, but they're almost non-existent in the majority world in places like Africa. So this is a longitudinal study with the topics of personality and mental health, also looking at lifespan development and what are the cultural mindset, what are the ways we can operationalize culture to understand differences. This study started with this collaboration in Namibia, PhD student from Namibia and PhD students here in Zurich from Germany. We expanded to Kenya thanks to some motivated colleagues there. And then we reached out to some people in South Africa to maybe just consult and co-author with us, but they very quickly wanted to join the study. So to do that with minimal funding, we added collaborators from 3 universities, and now we are this summer adding Ghana. So in order to access the diversity of these different countries, we have participants nested in research assistants who are from all over the countries. And each has recruited 50 to 100 participants who they then find again every 6 months. This is that was the team in Namibia. This is the team in Kenya and some of the students involved in South Africa. So yes, we started with samples of about 1,000 18-year-olds in each country. When we come to the later waves, every 6 months, we reach out to them again. We use WhatsApp here from the University of Zurich, wherever possible, but it's less than half our participants that have a smartphone. So mostly then the research assistants find them again. And sometimes that's allowed for things like giving them Africa Long Life Study t-shirts or headscarves. And we also do some qualitative interviews in subsamples. This is to describe the sample a little bit. It's half women, except in South Africa. You can see that most of our sample are full-time students who are single versus in any kind of relationship, and most don't have children, but that's a little different in Namibia, where we have slightly fewer who are students and slightly more who've already had children, and then describing their living situation, informal structure, or living in a living situation, living with another family means your family doesn't have their own house that they rent or own. And you can see it's very minimal in South Africa, but it's a good number in Kenya. Most have electricity and their own phone, but I think most of these are not smartphones. We do the surveys every 6 months. And some things we've just put in to find out what people's lives are like. Every wave, we have certain topics once a year: personality and mental health. We also always include some open-ended questions to find out what's important to the sample. In terms of mental health, some initial results from Daniel Hoffman are that pretty similar to what we saw in the persona study. Some of the dimensions are working better than others, and so we need to explore those. Also, in wave 1, it looks like at age 18, converging with things we saw in Namibia. It looks like religious engagement is predicting lower substance abuse, but it doesn't seem to be related to the other mental health conditions, at least at age 18. Okay, so some other, a small sample of some of the projects that are underway right now. So Daniel Hoffman also conducted some read-through, some cognitive interviews with some of our participants in Kenya to go through those mental health items to see where people might be understanding them better or worse. Selma Uwanga is working on interviews about motivations for alcohol use. We're looking at items to add. So we want to have a core set of items in the IMHA that stay the same for the longitudinal study, but we're also trying to fine tune as we go to contextualize. The WITS team is working on demographic predictors of disorders to develop their intervention work. We're looking at religious engagement longitudinally, and then we're addressing some measurement questions. Julia Rotzinger about how to measure SES in this group, and me very focused on how to measure personality. I wanted to just very briefly mention in 30 seconds, a colleague at the University of Zurich has a very interesting model that we've been enjoying discussing with them that might be relevant for this group. The galaxy model, based on this idea that the same stars overhead get sorted into slightly different constellations in different contexts. And they're now thinking about this metaphor in terms of psychological symptoms, for example, here with trauma. So this is a trauma constellation in Switzerland and then in Cambodia. Just wanted to mention their work as another possible interest. And that's all. Thank you for having me. And of course, a big thank you to the Africa Long Life Study team. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. We have time for one question. Anything online?
Hey, thank you very much. Really interesting. I just had a question about what you said right there at the end, the constellation metaphor, and something I've struggled with, and all of this is very new to me. When you have these different constellations of symptoms and different or manifestations of some latent variable in different contexts, why are you considering them constellations of the same thing? What if you've got something manifesting very differently? What is it that makes you think it's the same underlying condition or process? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I don't know that they would necessarily say, or that I would say, like that it's this exactly the same underlying condition. I guess it's about human beings not being just purely relativistic. Like, okay, here, if something happens and your daughter dies, we're really sad, but who knows how people feel somewhere else. It's a little bit accepting, like, no, human beings have a lot in common, and yeah, not trying to start completely from scratch everywhere else or assume other people are, completely different, but having room for the ways that the context, who talks to who about what's significant in this cultural context, that things are going to be both really shaped by the context, but also just very human. So I think what I like about their approach is that it tries to hold both things, and it doesn't say this is the correct constellation, people in China have made the wrong constellation. It's just like, here's the stars that everyone is seeing, and different, yeah. So I don't think it's trying to make one group right or wrong, but it's trying to find a way to draw comparisons.
Thanks.